This country is very easily forgotten, so much so that I almost forgot to make this video. Hey guys, welcome back to Nations of Minecraft. So, if the whole world in this Minecraft world were like a classroom, Minlia would be that shy girl who never talks much and is very quiet, but always does her homework on time. So let's see where it is. So, Minlia is located right here in the north, and it reaches so far north that we're going to have to extend the map to see the whole thing. So yeah, as you can see, Minlia reaches very far north and has a lot of islands. So even though Minlia may seem small, which it is, it does have a lot of extra territory. Only that territory is underground, ocean territory. So Minlia and their neighbor to the south, Thero, are both mining countries. Their economies center heavily on mining, and they own a lot of underground territory in the ocean. This is Thero's ocean territory, and this is Minlia's ocean territory. So, yeah, they have a lot of mining territory, so their real territory is a lot bigger than they look from a map. So, generally, Minlia can be broken up into three regions. There's the mainland, there are the islands, and there's this one far north island of Gorloth, which is no one lives there permanently. So, the islands, that's where the capital Mineland is located. The country Minlia is just, the name comes from the town Mineland, which is the capital. And this is, like, the only real town. This is where, like, most of the population lives. There are only a few scattered small settlements on the mainland, mostly just for mining purposes, and the island of Gorloth is literally just a camping, like a campground where it's rented out, but nobody lives there permanently. So, yeah, this is a biome map. They have a lot of different, very dry and unfarmable biomes, except for Gorloth, but no one lives there. So, yeah, they have, like, bush, shrub, frozen bush, dead fields, so you can't do any farming here. And that's why they specialize in mining, because you cannot farm anything there. And that also plays into how they structure their government, which we're going to talk about in a bit. So this is a population map. As you can see, almost everyone lives on the island where Mineland is located. Just a few little settlements around here, but yeah, almost everyone lives here. And this is a temperature map. It ranges from cool to cold. Since it's very far north, there are a lot of glaciers, especially in the Wilbur Ocean. It can get quite cold. And yeah, none of it's warm. So, like we said, terrible farming conditions. And another reason it's terrible for farming is that it's very dry. This is a humidity map. The only place that has, like, a good amount of rainfall is Gorloth, but like I said for the fifth time, nobody lives there. Now, this is a language map. They speak Theronian, just like their neighbor Thero to the south. And culturally, Minlia is very similar to Thero. They're like Thero's little sister. They also speak Theronian in this region of Genesis. So, Theronian and Genetian are the two Ravenian languages from this cultural area known as Ravenia. And you may be wondering if Ravenia is so similar culturally, why don't they just become one country? Well, like in Minlia, they don't really identify as Minlian. There's no like Minlian culture. They just identify as Ravenian, because you may be wondering if Ravenian is just like one culture. Why don't they just become one country? Well, it has to do with politics instead of culture. Even though these three countries share a lot of cultural similarities, they can't become just one Ravenia because of political differences. See, Thero is a monarchy. Genesis is a theocracy, and Minlia is a social democracy. And we'll talk about why they're a social democracy, and that has to do with their history. So, the history, first we have to talk about the history of Ravenia in general, before we can talk about the history of Minlia specifically. So, back in the ancient times when there were a lot of eastern and western tribes, there weren't any tribes in the area that would become Ravenia. There were just coastal nomads. And, like, because Ravenia was terrible for farming, they couldn't really make any settlements. Nobody made any settlements in Ravenia. I talked about how Minlia is terrible for farming. Basically, all of Ravenia is. So yeah, the coastal nomads were just wandering around through all of Ravenia, and they never made any settlements. But because these tribes from the east and the west would always trade with each other, the nomads would often get abused and taken advantage of and would have their resources stolen. So at one point, this one person named Raven, we don't know what species Raven was, but Raven was from the area that's now Minlia. He decided, in order to protect the coastal nomads, they needed to form tribes. So these 5 tribes were set up by Raven, but they were only tribes in name, not in practice, because this was only to protect the people, but the people were still nomadic and would move freely between these tribes. But they became known as the Ravenian tribes, and this whole region became known as Ravenia because of Raven. And Raven was hailed as a Ravenian hero because he was the one that protected the people of Ravenia from getting abused by the other people who actually had tribes. But even so, they didn't make any developments, they just sort of wandered freely in their lands until an immigrant named Distan came to the land and united 3 of the tribes into the Distan Empire. And he had a very good idea to make the tribes actually succeed. The tribes couldn't farm, but they could mine. They had a lot of mining resources. So his idea was that he set up a capital in what would later become the country of Minlia. He set up a capital here, and he said the people would mine resources, they would sell the resources to the western tribes, and they would buy bread from the western tribes, and then the bread would be distributed amongst the population. It was somewhat like socialist, but it worked really well, and the country actually developed. The empire developed, and eventually the Distan Empire became very powerful because they had so much bread, and they conquered basically everything. So at first, Ravenia was very happy about the Distan Empire because it gave them power, but after the Distan Empire conquered a lot more land, they started to center the empire less and less around Ravenia and more around the other region known as Navaket. And they even moved the capital from Ravenia to Navaket, and that made a lot of Ravenians feel very betrayed. So they felt like the rest of the East kind of appropriated their culture and sort of took over the Distan Empire. So that's why a lot of Ravenians actually started to like the Distan Empire less and less, even though they created it. So they formed their own Ravenian identity, separate from the Distan Empire, which they had kind of created. So yeah, much later there was the Green Plateau, and the Green Plateau made a province called Ravenia, because that's what the people in that region called themselves. And at first, Ravenia was totally useless, because remember, useless for farming, until they discovered a really good mine on this island. So they created the town of Mineland. By they, I mean me. I was the one who created this town. Do you like my architecture? I think it's pretty good. So yeah, they made the town of Mineland, and Ravenia became the mining province after the Green Plateau discovered how good they were for mining. And later, the Navaka Empire ruled over Ravenia, and including Mineland, and they were very upset about this. Ravenians didn't like Navaket to begin with, but Navaket was basically acting like a successor to the Distan Empire, so they felt like their culture was totally appropriated, and they did not like the Navaket Empire one bit. So the people of Mineland, what they wanted to do was they wanted to kind of recreate what the Distan Empire had originally been. So they started doing the same thing the Distan Empire once did. They began mining, selling their crops to Durlan, selling their ores to Durlan and buying crops from Durlan, and distributing them amongst the population, having the same sort of social democracy that Distan had. Well, Distan wasn't a democracy, but Mineland sort of set up their own government separate from the Navaket Empire. So later, the Kingdom of Ravenia split off from the Navaket Empire, but since Mineland already kind of had their own government system going, they liked Ravenia, but they didn't want to be part of the kingdom. They just wanted to do their own thing. So Minlia became its own separate country. Minlia would be a democracy, whereas Ravenia, which would then be called Thero, was its own kingdom. So yeah, that's the history of Minlia. That's how Minlia became what it is today. Minlia is kind of like a recreation of the Distan Empire, but just like a much weaker version. So if you choose to visit, some sites include this interestingly designed Capitol building. This is actually the only place where there's a Minlian flag in the world, because Minlians aren't that nationalistic at all. There are a lot of frozen ponds that are really cool to skate on and stuff, because it's cold. There's Mount Raven. This is the burial place of Raven, who basically started Ravenia. There's the old Distan Palace, which was the home of the Distan Emperor until they moved to Navaket after they sort of abandoned Ravenia. There's the island of Gorloth that I told you about. And yeah, that's pretty much it. There aren't a lot of things to see in Mineland, or Minlia because it's really small, but yeah, there are a few cool things. So, Minlia doesn't really interact that much with many other countries. They kind of have to have a good trading relationship with Durlan because Durlan sells them all their food. They're not exactly allied with Durlan, but they have to be on very good terms because, how else are they going to get food? But of course, their best friends, and really their only friends, would have to be Thero. Minlia is basically Thero's little sister. Thero is very protective of Minlia, and even though Minlia did not want to be part of Thero's monarchy, they're absolute best friends. They share the same culture and language, and these two will always be partners in business. So yeah, on the global scale, Minlia is not a very big deal, but they're a very kind and humble people and very dedicated to preserving their culture. Stay tuned. Aurea is coming up next.